all of us have to dedicate ourselves to making certain that we do everything we can to eradicate any barrier to the fair administration of justice for any person, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of social status. I became a judge in 1982. When I became a judge, and Judge Bennett has heard me tell this story, I was the first African-American woman to become a judge in Tennessee's history. The clerk of court staffed our court, and he was a good man. He was a white male, a middle-aged man, and he wanted to make certain that I had every tool I needed to be successful. And in staffing my courtroom, he staffed it thusly. When I opened court on September 1 of 1982, in the morning, I had an investiture ceremony. That afternoon, I had a docket in the same courtroom. I had 4 cases on my traffic docket. In staffing my courtroom, the clerk gave me 2 minute clerks. One African-American female who was seated below me and to my left, one African-American male who was seated below me and to my right. At a 45-degree angle, I had an African-American male prosecutor. And ringed around the courtroom, I had 4 African-American deputies, 1 female and 3 males, each with their standard issue Smith & Wesson weapon at their side and in uniform. The first person to come into my courtroom that afternoon was a young white male. As he looked around the courtroom, his eyes grew as wide as half-dollar bills. And he came to the bench with fear and trepidation, and he requested a continuance. And I granted it. 30 days later, he came back to court, armed with an African-American defense attorney. I told Mr. Goldsby, you know, we need to change out a little bit of the personnel in here. I understand why you did what you did, but we really need to move it because every person in every courtroom across this country ought to have a reasonable expectation that they will receive justice. And that man knew nothing about me and I knew nothing about him, but something told me that he didn't believe in that instance that he could get justice. What fueled that had to be culture and a whole lens through which we view society. And that's what Judge Bennett is going to talk about today.
How many of you have heard of Project Implicit or taken the implicit association test online? Oh, we've only got maybe 3 or 4. Well, the one takeaway point I hope from this whole conference, and certainly from our presentation, is when you go back to your homes this weekend, just put into what your search engine of choice, IAT or implicit association test, and take 6 or 7 minutes, which is all it takes to take the test, because it's the single best way to determine your subconscious implicit biases. And I guarantee you, you have many. You have many. And the way I got hooked into the implicit bias movement is kind of an interesting story. I've taught an advanced employment discrimination class at Drake Law School for 25 years with a co-professor. And we use a real live case that I currently have pending, and the students argue summary judgment motions, and we covered all the doctrines and everything. But about 10 or 12 years ago, my co-professor said, hey, have you taken the IAT? And I said, what's an IAT? And he explained it to me, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. And I had been a civil rights lawyer. And actually, we were the second law firm in Iowa integrated at the partner level. And my partner was African American. And my mother died when I was very young. And I was raised by the only African American woman in our community. Actually, she wasn't from our community, but she came in. She was really like my second mother. That's what I called her, even though my father, you know, they didn't have a romantic relationship. So I had strong and deep ties. And most of my cases were employment discrimination cases, did a lot of class action work representing African Americans all over the country. So I took the IAT, and I was just stunned at the result. I had a very high implicit bias against African Americans. So I did what any good lawyer would do. I assumed the test was invalid. I proceeded to take it again, scored the same thing. I repeatedly took it. I waited a couple days, took it again. High implicit bias. So I did all my research, and I was absolutely convinced, really beyond a reasonable doubt, that the test is valid. So I encourage you to take the test. I was just on it last night looking, and there's a new test on implicit bias towards pets. There's about 100 different tests you can take, so you can find out if you have implicit bias towards tests. But the thing of it is, and this is why it's important for criminal defense lawyers, implicit biases predict behavior. If it didn't predict behavior, it'd be okay. We have these implicit biases, but it doesn't affect judgments that we make. But cognitive psychologists have proved that it does. I want to give you a little peek into emerging neuroscience of implicit bias, and it's the amygdala. Amygdala is a Latin phrase meaning almond. And do any of you know what the amygdala is? Oh, we've got one amygdala person, too. That's great. Okay. Well, here's how we know. Functional MRIs. Has anybody had a functional? You've all probably had MRIs, at least if you've reached anywhere close to my age. But has anybody had a functional MRI? You would know it because you're in an MRI machine, usually for an hour to 2 hours, and you're taking a test. And they're measuring your brain while you're taking a test. And so I volunteered 2 years ago for a study at Vanderbilt where they were studying views on crime and punishment. So I went into an MRI machine, I was strapped down, and my fingertips could hit a button, and they'd show me one hypothetical after another for 2 hours. And on the hypothetical, I would have to measure how serious of a crime I thought it was, kind of the measure of criminal responsibility, and then what the punishment should be. So one hypothetical I remember because it was amusing to me was a frat boy going to a frat party and somebody drugs him. Isn't that a strange twist on reality? And then he goes out, and because he's on this date rape drug, he burns down the neighbor's house. And the question was, is he criminally responsible? Where did I place him on the degree of criminal responsibility? What would the punishment be? And the whole time, MRI machine is running, and so they measure your brain activation. So that's how we know about the amygdala and the science of implicit bias. And now they're starting to figure out the science of prejudice and stereotyping from a neuroscience perspective. So this is the amygdala. I'm sorry, it's right in here. It's a little almond-shaped. There's various parts to it. And that's where we have the, let me show you another picture of it. That's where we have the, whoops, I'm going to go back, sorry. That's where we have the fear response. And so I start my Harvard Law Review article with a true story about Jesse Jackson walking down the street in Chicago late one night. And he hears these footsteps behind him. And his heart starts beating faster, and he's getting nervous, and he can tell that they're young men, and he's worried about maybe he's going to be the victim of a robbery. And they get closer and closer, and he speeds up. I'm sure you've all had situations like that. I know I have. And then they're getting closer and closer, and he turns around, and they're white. And he has a huge sense of relief. Now, what was going on when his heart started racing? What was going on was his amygdala was being activated because that's where the fear response is in all mammals. The fear response is in our amygdala. It's important to know that neuroscientists are looking at this because this is going to be the key from a neuroscience perspective of how to de-bias people and our implicit biases. That's why it's important for lawyers.